daradidam, didaram, daridaram, daram.
Okay, welcome everyone. Welcome, Mr. Kushner. It is good to see you.
Good to see you. So I got a lot of positive feedback on my
Yeah, I saw one from some guy who hasn't lived here for 30 years.
what is it?
I'll tell you later. I don't want to
Hold on, I'm
discuss it now.
talking,
It'll take up the whole class. I'm going to call you right after the class.
Hold on.
Call you right after the class, Bob. We got to talk about holy things here. Okay. So I'm going to do a share screen. New share. And
Okay.
we're going to go here, share, and share. Okay. And present. It's
He
hiding.
probably knows more not having lived here 30 years than people who are living here.
Everything is possible. I'll discuss it with you later, Bob. Okay, can everyone see the screen?
Yeah, but I got to see you.
Oh,
And then
that could be
please
arranged.
screen.
Voila! It all could be arranged.
We don't see anything, Rabbi. Don't get too
We see
excited.
you. I see you, but your face isn't on there.
Wait, but you don't see the screen?
I just got a new offer from VW, Joe.
Oh,
Guys, can you see the words foundations of political power or not?
yes.
Okay, that's all we need.
I'm ready to trade in, Joe.
Okay. Maybe you will trade.
Okay, let's go. No, so here, we're gonna discuss what we discussed last time, okay? And then we're gonna go to some of the other questions. So we're discussing the relationship between Jews and a non-Judaic political power. And we talked about taxes last week. We talk about that that one may resist unfair taxes, unfair meaning not in how much they charge you, but that they discriminate against one group or where it's corrupt, which means to say everyone gets charged on an arbitrary level and people are scooping off from the top for themselves. So otherwise, on all monetary matters, so if, for example, the Torah demands, I'm not saying it does, a 30-day warranty on something, and the law of the land of the state says you need a 90-day warranty, well, then you have to provide the 90-day warranty. You know, under Jewish law, signing a document is enough to transfer property, but if there's some other step that you need under secular law, well, so be it. The Talmud discusses extensively that if someone owes property tax and doesn't pay it, you're allowed to buy that property at auction from the non-Jewish government, even though the original owner was a Jew, because they're within their rights to take the property if you don't pay your property taxes. If property taxes are arbitrary and how much you pay depends on how much the person in charge of the taxes likes you, well, that's illegitimate and unjust, and you have every right to avoid paying those taxes. As Maimonides says, these people are no better than armed robbers. And it's interesting because in Common Sense, Thomas Paine says that the kings of Europe are merely the descendants of robbers and brigands, and the better robbers and the better brigands and the better criminals, the more successful criminals ultimately became kings. So without knowing it, he really echoes Maimonides. But before we go any further, which is talking about legitimacy of government and the appropriateness of revolutions and the like, I want to talk a little bit about other things besides taxation and the laws of business. So for example, now the law of the land is the law means to say that the people accept the law and follow it. For example, I believe it is still illegal in Massachusetts, or at least it used to be on the books. You weren't allowed to have a bath on Sunday until midday because they wanted people going to church. Even if that's still the law, no one keeps it. And there's a range of laws all over the country and in municipalities all over the country and all over the old world that still are on the books, but no one pays any attention to them. And why do I mention this? Because a law that no one in other words, the premise of a law is that the government promulgated the law and it's accepted and kept by the people. A law that is not kept by the people. I'll give you a classic example. How many of you are familiar with New York City? Any of you?
Sure.
Okay. Now, what happens twice a week in every residential street in the 5 boroughs?
Garbage collection.
No, that's true too, but there's something else. Not garbage collection, something closely related done by the same Department of Sanitation.
Open the sewer,
Oh,
open the hydrants.
No, you clearly
No.
haven't been in New York long enough.
that's it has to do with the parking spaces.
Right. The alternate side of the street parking. Because New York streets get dirty, twice a week, every day on big streets, they clean the streets. You can't clean the streets if there's cars there. And so you have to park somewhere else. The problem is there is no parking in New York City. So what does everyone do? So like on my parents' block, if any of you know what a block is, it's 11 to 1 twice a week. So from 11 to 1, everyone who's still home or who works from home, which is common today, they get into their cars and they double park them on the other side of the street. And the police do not give tickets during those 2 hours. 2 hours and 1 minute later, they give tickets. But they don't give tickets during those few hours. So the question now, there is no dispensation. There is nothing on the books that permits double parking. Technically, you're double parking, it's illegal, and you can get an $80 ticket. Many years ago, some wise guy, young cop, came across a street of double parked cars because it was alternate seat of this parking day, and he gave everyone a ticket. Not only was he almost beaten beyond recognition. No, he wasn't beaten, but his fellow cops had to save him by the locals. When he got to the station, his fellows almost wanted to beat him with an inch of his life, because it's a unwritten, agreed upon law in New York, completely against the law, that during the alternate side of the parking you can double park. But the law remains on the books that you're never allowed to double park unless you're picking up a package or something. So the fact is, this law against double parking is not only not kept, no one enforces it. So as a Jew, are you obliged not to double park on my parents' block in Brooklyn during street alternate side? No, because the law on the books is meaningless unless it is enforced by the government. So now we bring to something close to a member of this group's heart: speeding. So we know, since the last time in good weather, in light traffic, anyone got a ticket for going 70 on the 91. For most of the 91, the speed limit is 65. So you could get a hefty ticket for going 70. I haven't seen anyone stopped for merely going 70.
70, Rabbi, at 70, you can get a ticket, but at 79, you don't get a ticket.
I don't know about that, but I know that the traffic is usually flowing at 75 miles an hour and they don't give anyone a ticket.
At least.
Right. Which reminds me of a story that someone was once speeding in Texas, and he gets pulled over by a state trooper, and he says, "You were going 80." At that time, the speed limit was 55. But he says, yeah, everyone else was going 82. So this was a young guy from out of state. So the Texas police state trooper looks at him and says, son, you ever go fishing? Yeah. Did you catch all the fish in the river? No. Well, I caught you. So,
The fish.
but the point being, of course, in Montana, in order to keep federal funding at the time of the 55 mile an hour speed limit, they had to enforce the 55 mile an hour speed limit. Montana is pretty empty. You drive as fast as you think you're safe. If you go off the road, the bears will get to you before the ambulance does. So, so it's self-regulating. So at any rate, so what they did was, and they had to give a certain amount of tickets a year, the federal government would say they're not enforcing it. So they invented, because the 55 mile an hour speed limit was created for what purpose? To save gas. So they did something called a fuel wasting ticket. If you were driving too fast in Montana and the cop needed to match their quota of tickets, he'd pull you over and give you a $5 fuel wasting ticket. But what the problem was, they didn't want to clog up the court system. So at every state police barracks, and apparently some grocery stores too, you can look into this. And this was in the 70s. They sold books of tickets, of $5 tickets. You bought a tab for $50. You bought it, and when the guy stopped, you just ripped off the coupon and went on your merry way. But at any rate, so clearly, someone going 85 in Montana who only gets a $5 fuel wasting ticket, clearly the government of Montana doesn't particularly care if you speed, nor do the good citizens of Montana care, and therefore, there is no dina de machuta dina. There is no law of the land is the law. There is no Torah mitzvah, no halachic obligation to follow the speed limit in such a case. Conversely, if it's dangerous, you're not allowed to endanger yourself or others. So, if the weather's bad, etc. But we're not talking about that. We're talking solely about the law of the land is the law. So, So if it's the eve of Shabbat and you want to get home and it's late and you're speeding, well, so if you feel it's so, if they pull you over, you have to pay your ticket. You can't lie to get out of it. Because you don't have to go home. You could always sleep in your car over Shabbat or something. But be that as it may, this is not a case of the conflict of the law of the land and the Torah, because you do have options. Where for some reason there's no option except to speed, and keeping Shabbat comes ahead of the law of the land, provided it's not dangerous. So then you have to take whatever penalty comes your way and accept it. That's just the price you pay for living in a lawful society. Now, on the other hand, something that is the law of the land, here's another characteristic, something that is the law of the land, another scenario, and also prohibited by American law, but American law does not take it seriously, does not penalize people. The law of the land is law only works to make you be obligated to do things that the Torah doesn't obligate you and the law of the land does. But it's not reductionist. If the law of the land allows something, either by not paying attention to it, or that doesn't change the law of the Torah. Let me give you an example. It is illegal to steal. And therefore, if you're in the grocery store and you see grapes and you want to taste the grape to see if it's a good grape, so both by Jewish law and the law of the land, it's stealing. But the grocery store does not prosecute people for stealing one grape, for eating a grape. But nevertheless, since if you ask them, they'd say, please don't do it, and they don't like it, and if they see someone to do it, they stop it. So since the store doesn't want you to do it, it continues to be theft according to Jewish law, even though it's not enforced under secular law, under the state law. So again, the fact that something is not enforced, if it's forbidden by the Torah, the fact that it's not enforced doesn't allow you to do it unless it's a monetary situation where you're allowed to. So if the store explicitly says, try a grape, like Trader Joe's always has like different little cups of coffee and snacks to try. Some are kosher. Costco, the same thing. So then that's okay. But if it's something that they don't want you to do, they just don't prosecute it, and the police don't bother with it, and it's forbidden under Torah law, it remains completely forbidden under Torah law. And this covers the basic premises of the law of the land with regards to living in a ordered society in which you follow the law. So, for example, in Tsarist Russia, the state had a monopoly on the postal service. In other words, they did not allow, as in the United States mail, they did not allow private carriers of letters, only the state. So sometimes the Chafetz Chaim, the great rabbi, the great rabbi of the 1870s to the 1930s, so till World War I, he lived in Poland under Russian rule. So even though the Tsarist government wasn't so nice to the Jews, when he sent a letter with a friend, he would buy a postage stamp and tear it up because he felt that the law of the land did not allow him to cause the government to lose money. And since the law of the land is the law, the Chafetz Chaim kept it carefully. However, as I mentioned before, the Tsarist government had a candle tax. The candle tax we don't make people liable for because it was specifically directed against Jews and was discriminatory because only Jews were taxed on their candles. And therefore, it was entirely appropriate to find ways to sneak away to get away with that tax. And so too with many other things in Eastern Europe, where, for example, like the African American, as you know, there was a very heavy poll tax to be allowed to vote in the South, but they only charged it to African Americans, basically disenfranchising the African American community. So that kind of tax, you're not obliged to pay, and you should try to get away with paying because it discriminates against one group in favor of another, not for logical reasons of money and the like. So that we covered mostly last week. And now we go to the question of the legitimacy of political power, which means to say the law of the land is the law of the kingdom is the law, but what makes a kingdom? What makes a government? What makes someone have the right to rule you?
Rabbi.
Yes.
I read on the newspaper Haaretz that the Haredi community is not following the protocols of the coronavirus.
So first of all, just when you say that reading Haaretz is like reading the New York Times, you can't believe anything it says there. That's first of all. Haaretz is an extreme left-wing paper. They're self-hating Jews who hate the state of Israel and hate all religious Jews.
No, Rabbi, let's not exaggerate.
Please. Haaretz is an extreme left-wing rag. They have Gideon, what's his name, writing there. And Amira Haas, the traitor. You kidding?
Extreme.
And this is public. This is a public broadcast. And I will tell you, Haaretz is that being said, it is true. In this case, Natalie, they are half right. It is absolutely true that far too many people who belong to the Haredi, the religious community, are not keeping the rules. For that matter, a very large percentage of the secular public, the non-religious public, are not keeping the rules, having parties by the beach and in clubs and underground raves and so on. In other words, disobedience is a common factor. The most common factor of this disobedience is that both among the Haredim and the club goers of Tel Aviv, they tend to be young and tend to feel invulnerable. But the problem is a young person who gets COVID might not get very sick, but could kill their grandparents. Okay?
Yeah.
So the answer is, one, it's unacceptable not to keep the rules.
Yeah.
Two, it is the Haaretz likes pointing at the Haredim, who are visible because they're obvious, but not keeping the rules is a general Israeli problem, especially among young Israelis. who feel invulnerable, especially if they made it through 3 years of the army and survived, right? So, so yes, it's a problem. Yes, it exists in the.
Well, if we look to religious community, okay, let's forget it's Haredi or any other label. Yeah, let's forget about the label. But if we talk about a religious community, and this community have studied long years the Torah, knows so many laws, and still is not
It's a good question.
rising to this responsibility that
It's
is
a good.
all over the world.
It
It's
is a
not
very good
about
question.
one thing, one country. It's not one country. It's all over the world, and it's not for the minister, the prime minister, or this politician. No, it's not that. As you said, the grandparents may be in danger. So
Right. No, look, you're 100% right. And I've spoken about this and yelled at people and written emails and and stopped people on the street. This is a general problem throughout much of the world, except the Oriental countries. And part of it has to do with the people feeling vulnerable. Part of it has to do, that younger people feel very cooped up. I'm not making excuses. I'm merely saying that this is a general problem throughout the world. It's a problem in Brazil, as you know, and it's a problem in the US. And frankly, it's a problem in France and England and even Germany, where people tend to follow all the rules exactly and always cut on the dotted line, and certainly in Israel. And now, the fact is that for the religious Jews, it's a bigger problem because Torah says you have to be extremely careful to the point of almost ridiculousness with regards to matters of health. And part of the problem is there's a lot of misinformation out there. And it used to be, in order to disseminate information, you had to have enough money to publish a newspaper. Today, any idiot can get a nice internet you can go on something like Constant Contact and get a nice frame, a nice newsletter, and put it out. And it looks like the New York Times, or the Wall Street Journal, and it's some imbeciles raving. So people are getting that information from bad places. And so the answer is, yes, it's a problem. Yes, it's wrong. Yes, I condemn it. No, it's not just religious Jews, and for Haaretz to call them out and not all the young people with underground parties and basements is a little bit disingenuous, to say the least. But I don't expect better of Haaretz. Haaretz is like the New York Times with no shame.
But this whole thing has also to do with free will, because my free will may affect your free will. So, and that's exactly what we can see now with the pandemics. Yeah.
Well, and that's why under Jewish law, you have to keep
the other very clearly.
Look, you're right. Under Jewish law, you have to keep all the rules. And everyone who knows me here knows that I've been quite emphatic about that. That being said, there's a lot of misinformation, and people seize on it. Since it's inconvenient to keep the rules, people seize on the misinformation. Now, it turns out there are halachot about how to deal with information. And those halachot are not being followed. But that's it's really another whole story. We have discussed it on our forums here. I think before I got everything on Zoom. And we can discuss it again. That could be our next big idea. We can talk about public health and vaccines. The obligation to get the vaccine, the obligation to wear masks and so on. And we certainly can talk about it. The problem is that you have people who believe the misinformation, and that changes their halachic calculus. And that's a very big problem, which I don't have an answer to. This pandemic the problem is we're not used to dealing with diseases we're not used to dealing with infectious diseases that can't be cured with a pill. Okay, we're just not used to it. And we've not had one for 100 years in the West. And therefore, that's been a very bad precedent. We've gotten, lazy. But at any rate, be that as it may, those who do not follow the protocols are violating Jewish law. And this is not a question of the law of the land as the law, because Jewish law is stricter than any national law. Rabbi Schachter of Yeshiva University, one of the truly great rabbinic authorities of the time, respected across the board, not just in his corner, pointed out that even when the states eased restrictions, not necessarily should the synagogues have eased restrictions, because Jewish law is stricter than the law of the land about precautions regarding disease. And therefore, again, the law of the land can add to Judaism, but it can't subtract from it. But this is a whole topic. Let's go back to our topic, and we can do another session on public health and Judaism. Okay. So here we have, here the Jewish people take a king. Samuel warns them against the danger of taking a king, right? But they took a king, and now they have to listen to him. However, what happens if you feel that a king is demanding things of you that you make him no longer willing to accept? So here's the story.
Joe.
Here's the story. This is.
I found out that you can make the screen bigger if you go to the right. Now I can see it bigger. You can try it there.
Yeah, the little dots. You can zoom. Anyways, so the man Yeravam ben Nevat was a descendant of Ephraim, and King Solomon made him a leader. However, he found that King Solomon, Shlomo HaMelech, imposed very onerous taxes on the Jewish people. And a lot of the Jews from the northern tribes felt that the taxes were more than they wanted, and they didn't want a king who taxed them so thoroughly, sort of like the whole taxation without representation thing. So the man Yeravam was a mighty man of valor. And Shlomo saw this young man, he was a diligent worker, and he appointed him in charge of all the burdens, that means to say all the taxation of the house of Yosef. And it came to be at that time, Yeravam left Jerusalem. He's a newly appointed governor of the tribe of Joseph, the Chachia the Shilon. He found him on the way. And he was wearing a new garment, Yeravam, and the two of them were into the field. And the garment's an overcoat, okay? He didn't take his pants. And Achia grasped the new garment that was upon him and tore it into 12 pieces. And he said to Yeravam, take for yourself 10 pieces. So as the Lord, the God of Israel said, I shall tear the kingdom out of Shlomo's hands, and I'll give you the 10 tribes. But he will have one tribe for my servants David's sake and for Jerusalem's sake, the city I have chosen for all the tribes of Israel. And what happened was...
What are you doing? You're going back and forth here.
1 minute. Now, so I'm going to paraphrase the rest of what happened. So Yeravam basically started telling the people of Yosef that they shouldn't pay their taxes to Solomon. So Solomon sent someone to arrest him for treason. So he ran away to Egypt. And then what happened was that the elders of the tribes came to Rechavam, the son of Solomon, after Solomon died, and they told Rechavam, you have to reduce the taxes because, yes, we've had a lot of wealth, we've had a lot of success, Israel's empire has grown, but the taxes are too much for the middle class. So Rechavam consulted with the elders who had advised his father, Shlomo, and they said, the people have a point. Shlomo did a lot of good public works, but the taxes are a little bit too much. So you need to placate them and you need to reduce their tax burden. And then Yeravam went to talk to his friends, described in the Tanakh basically as spoiled brats he grew up with who never had been in the real world. And they said, no, you're a king, you gotta be tough. And Rechavam listened to the youngsters, big mistake, and called the Jews together and said, listen, but if my father flogged you with whips, I will flog you with scorpions. And you'll listen to me or I'll break you. So the children of the other 10 tribes said, Le'ahalecha Yisrael, To your tents, O Israel. Goodbye, Charlie. We no longer want you to be our king. We no longer want the house of David to rule us. We're going home, and we're not paying taxes, and we're not sending people to work for you. So Israel revolted against the house of David until this day. Yeravam heard that they rebelled against the house of David. He saw his opportunity, came back from Egypt. And when it came to be, when all of Israel heard that Yeravam had returned, they sent and called him to the assembly, and they made him king over all Israel. There was none that followed the house of David except the tribe of Judah alone. Later, the tribe of Benjamin joined. And Rehoboam came to Jerusalem, and he assembled all the house of Judah and all the tribe of Benjamin, 180,000 chosen warriors, to wage war with the house of Israel, to return the kingdom to Rehoboam, the son of Shlomo. So he says, I'm the rightful king. You guys are the rebels. We're going to unrebel you. And the word of God was to Shemaiah, the man of God. He was a prophet, saying, speak to Rehoboam, the son of Shlomo, the king of Yehuda, and to all the house of Judah and Benjamin, and the rest of the people, saying, thus said Hashem, you shall not go up, and you shall not go to war with your brothers, the children of Israel. This is all about 900 BC, by the way. Return each man to his home, for this thing has been brought about by me. And they heeded the word of Hashem, and they returned to go home in accordance with the word of Hashem. Now, so the question is now, what was this a unique situation? So some commentators say that this was a unique situation. In other words, really they had no business rebelling against their king, but in this case, Hashem promised to take away the tribes from Shlomo and to make 2 kingdoms, and therefore this fulfilled that prophecy. But many of the other commentators say no, absolutely not. They were within their rights. A king is only a king for as long as he has the confidence of the people and their willingness to submit to him. Monarchy is okay, but the people, once a majority of the people and the majority of a tribe, let alone the majority of the tribes, no longer feel confident in this king and no longer want to pay his taxes and see him as an unlawful power over them, they have the right to say goodbye, Charlie. In other words, go to your tents, O Israel, and the appointing of Yeravam as the king was entirely within their rights, because one must obey a king, absolutely, but there's a point where you no longer are willing to submit yourself to this king, where as a unit, the majority of the people say, you're not our king, and the majority of the tribe says, you're not our king. And I should point out, if you remember the story, that after Saul died, the tribe of Benjamin and some of the other tribes followed Ishbosheth, King Saul's son, and only later did and David only ruled over Judah. Over time, they made David their king, but willingly. David did not conquer them, did not wage war against them, because David was not allowed to rule them until the majority of each tribe willingly submitted to David. So what do we see? So here, we've already explained the kings of the David dynasty may be judged and testimony given against them, because a king must follow the law. But later kings, Alexander Yanai, the Hasmonean kings, didn't follow the Sanhedrin, so they decided that they're not allowed to sit in judgment or be judged. In other words, they're out of the system because they didn't respect the system. But technically, a king has to obey the law. And technically, if a king commits a capital offense, you can kill him, and so on. In other words, by the Torah, a king is always a constitutional monarch. The problem is that many kings in the first and second temple didn't listen. So this is background that even Jewish king, a descendant of David, a dynasty appointed by God, if the people say, hey, you're not ruling us in a way we want, and we don't want to be part of this, no one can stop them. All the more so a king who's not appointed by God.
Rabbi, there is only one problem. That only indicates that the king was not strong enough to enforce his rule. had he
No,
an
because Hashem,
army and send it and kill people like was
Who?
happening all over the world, then they would have submitted. They could have said,
well,
we
there might
don't
have been a
like
civil
you.
war, and they could have
Yeah,
lost, and Shlomo
exactly.
and Rechavam could have lost the civil war. But my point is here that the prophet of Hashem comes. God sends a prophet, and God says, Rechavam, go home. God says you have no right to disrupt this revolution because they have lost willingness to be governed by you. And the question the commentators struggle with, was this a legitimate right that is part of the law as if it were, or was it a unique situation? But since this seems to be a sticky point, I will show you. A moment. One moment, please. I'm looking for someone here. Okay. Here. Okay, so here we are. I'm looking for this one. There we are. Right. So basically the question. So interesting question. So the Radak, Reb David Kimchi, raises an interesting question, which is relevant to this whole discussion. He says, didn't God promise David that he would be a king, you know, that his descendants would be a king as long as there was a king in the Jewish people, and that he would rule forever? So they said, yeah, look, your tribe likes you. You have Jerusalem and the temple. We don't deny. We're going to our tents. We're not saying we're deposing you. Those who want you to rule them, rule them. We don't want you to rule us, and this doesn't contradict God's word. So it's clear that telling a king, goodbye, Charlie, because we as a nation, we as a tribe, we as 12 tribes want to walk away. And they had legitimate complaints. Here's the point. They had legitimate complaints. That's a reason to break up. If you want to compare this with the Confederacy had no legitimate complaint because they wanted to perpetuate the incredibly cruel slavery of a population in a way that even at a time the Torah permitted slavery would not have permitted that behavior. So they had nothing to stand on. Here they had a legitimate point because the taxes were onerous, and a king is not supposed to pose onerous taxes. At any rate, that's the story. So now,
Rabbi,
we go to the next question. The next question is, okay, so we understand that there is a right, that you have a right to say, I don't want you to be our government anymore, but it has to be a majority of the nation, or at least a majority of the tribe. I mean, in this case, it was a majority of the nation. It could be if it was only 6 tribes, it wouldn't have been legitimate. So now
sometimes the tribes are so blind, so deaf, so hysterical.
Yeah.
then it's difficult to make them see it clearly.
Right, but that is why a prophet got involved. In other words, the prophet told the people that Hashem's God said you're right. You know, if you don't have a prophet, you have to be very careful. You know, because the law established by the king is a binding law.
Mm-hmm.
Rabbi, there is a little problem.
Yeah, one
We
second
are-
before I get to the
we-
problem, Joel, I'm
We
just
are
looking.
we're advancing a little too far because all we have to do is go back to King David. His son is rebelling against him. He takes 10 tribes and it's a civil war.
He doesn't
between
take 10 tribes. It's mostly
and-
the men of Jerusalem and Judah who followed him.
And King David is chased out of Jerusalem. He's running for his life. He's almost killed.
Right, but this is a
But
coup d'etat.
when his son is killed, I guess the 10 tribes said, okay, enough
Well, it
is
wasn't the
enough.
10 tribes. It was primarily Judea. And it says he stole the heart of Israel. And the point is, he deceived them. He was dishonest. And in the end, the people came back to David. That's how David won. So that's exactly the example of the wrong kind of rebellion, of a coup d'etat. Now, here is really interesting. When does the above apply? When the coins issued by a king are the tender of the land. This indicates the inhabitants have accepted him and consider him to be the leader and themselves to be his subjects. What this means is that there used to be a lot of different coins circulating. So if people specifically accept the coins of the king, and they're willing to, and they use them willingly, and they prefer to use them. So this is a sign back in the time when you had lots of choices in coins. So this was a sign they accepted him as a king. So I have to say, this is from Maimonides, that Maimonides is only giving this as an example. In other words, if people willingly use this currency, this demonstrates that they've accepted the rule of this king upon themselves. But it's not really about the currency. In other words, this indicates the issue here is not the indication. The issue is that they've accepted him and consider him to be the leader and themselves to be his subjects. If, however, the issues are not to tender the land, he's considered to be a robber who takes by the force of arms. But the point is, this is just a litmus test. The fact is that anytime you have a king where the people don't accept him as their king and don't want him as their king, and as we saw earlier, it's a majority of the people, then he and his servants are like a band of armed thieves whose laws are not binding. Such a king and his servants are considered to be robbers in all respects. So anytime you have a government that the majority of the people of the land, I'm saying a majority, it may be bigger than a majority, but a very large proportion of the people don't accept this person as their king, as the case with Rechavam, then he's no longer a king. So in other words, the definition of a legitimate government is that which the people of the land, whatever the political unit is, and basically it's the highest level of government. So I researched this a great deal. So why do we talk about a king? Because a king, until recently, was the only form of government primarily out there. And the king is the highest level of government. You have local governments and provinces, and then you have the king, who has no one he has to obey except God himself, as if it were. So the highest level so where you have the people, which would seem to mean a majority of the people, or a significant majority of the people, don't accept an individual as the authority over their land, whatever that land is. So, for example, Poland was ruled by the Austrians, the Prussians, and the Russians, but the Poles themselves were always seeking to revolt, and they never accepted any of these kings as their legitimate kings. There were constant revolts. So such a king and his servant are considered to be robbers in all respects, apropos of Thomas Paine in Common Sense.
Yeah.
So now, but if you don't like a government, or if a small minority of people, say, like the Branch Davidians, that our leader is the Messiah, and we don't have to listen to the government. Well, that doesn't count. But we're a very large majority. We're the people, however you define the people, of a given political entity. Say this person is not to be our king. So therefore, both, even though the results were not good in two of them, the French, Russian, and American revolutions, and the Velvet Revolution in the 1880s and so on, the revolutions in South America against the Spanish, and Central America against the Spanish colonialists, all these were legitimate revolutions, because it's very clear that a very large majority of Mexico or the United States or Argentina or what became, or France or Russia, clearly didn't want the Tsar and didn't want the Spanish king and didn't want the British king and didn't want the French king, and so on. So, in other words, where you reach this point, but if someone says, I have a theory, and because of this theory, I have 100,000 people in a country of 300 million agree with me, that is not illegitimate. Those people must swallow their ideas, buckle down, pay their taxes, and follow the laws, because they don't represent the people as a whole. There's no, in other words, Jewish law, and not just Jewish law, the premise of Jewish ethics as it applies to mankind as a whole suggests that no minority has the right to refuse to obey the laws of the land in which they live. That's the, and it makes no difference, as the Rambam said, Maimonides said earlier, whether it's a Jewish government or a non-Jewish government. No one has the right not to obey the laws of the land in which you live unless the government itself is illegitimate. And illegitimate means that the people no longer want this person to be their ruler. No, not that they complain, not that they groan and moan, but that they say this person is so bad or this government is so bad that we want no part in it. And assuming they're morally right, even if a majority of the people want to overthrow a government because they want to engage in bad behavior, that doesn't count. And that's why we needed a prophet to come and tell the Rechavam that the people are within their rights and they're not doing something that is forbidden by the Torah. Okay, so that is that's that. Does anyone have any questions or comments on the matter?
At that time, they had prophets. And what about today, nowadays, that we don't have people with divine inspiration? Sometimes, as you said before, there is divine providence, but not divine inspiration. So how are we going to have someone to guide a very big community or people?
Well, no, so you don't need that to guide. Any government is legitimate as long as it has the acceptance of a majority of its people. In other words, you don't need divine inspiration. In other words, you might not like the government, but as long as the system, when the system breaks down and people feel that they can no longer obey it, so that's how revolutions happen. But you might not like a particular prime minister or president or so on, but as long as the system is not corrupt and as long as the people are willing to accept the system, so you go along. You don't need divine knowledge to not to obey the law of the land. That's the whole point of these 2 weeks, that you have to obey the law of the land unless the law itself is illegitimate, which doesn't mean you don't like the law. It means that the ruler, in other words, the law can be unfair as long as the system is not illegitimate. How is the system illegitimate? Because the people don't accept it. You don't need divine inspiration to know that. It's pretty obvious when the people no longer, that's what happened, in the former Soviet Union. That's what happened in the Warsaw Pact. The Ceausescus woke up in Romania one day and no one wanted to be ruled by them anymore. And ditto for East Germany and so on.
Yeah, this kind of awareness is not so easy to have.
True.
That's what we have seen in the whole history. And especially now that people get so much information that is not either good
Right.
or
But you know, but the yes, I agree. But the point is, before someone goes and starts messing around with the order with the order of the country, they have to ask, is the law legitimate? And if it is legitimate, which means that it's accepted by the majority of people in the country, you have to obey the law if you don't like it. You know, personally, I think speed limits are set way too low. You know, they weren't made for modern cars. But nevertheless, I more or less I obey the law within the limits that those who enforce the law are willing to allow. You know, and it's the same with a lot of things. Give you an example. Is everyone here familiar with the mortgage interest deduction? American law, tax law, the tax code gives you the right to deduct from your taxes, to deduct from your income that anything you pay for your primary residence, right, Bob?
Correct.
To a certain limit.
Well,
Now-
there's a limit now, yeah.
Right. Now, let us say you're a rabbi or a clergy who gets parsonage, which means I get money tax-free to rent or buy a place. In other words, if I work for a religious organization and they give me $1,000 a month to pay mortgage or rent on a place to live, so that is not considered income at all under American law. It's completely exempt from tax. Now, so let's say I pay a mortgage with that $1,000. So that $1,000 is already free from tax. But nevertheless, the IRS allows me to deduct the $1,000 a second time when I pay the mortgage. And it makes no sense. And theoretically, it could be challenged in court, but the IRS has never challenged it. So are you allowed to take advantage of that? Yes, for as long as the government doesn't care about this seeming contradiction, it's fine. And the point being, no one is obliged to go make a donation to the government on that basis.
You're supposed to take as much of a deduction.
As you can. And
Yeah.
at least this was the way years ago. I don't know today, but when I was,
Yeah.
when I had a house, that was the story. So the point is that even though it makes no sense and goes against the logic of the law, as long as the government accepts it, you can do it. But, if you want to go and start making riots and so on, and start burning down police stations or ransacking the Capitol or anything in between, at that point, even if you don't like the government and feel it's unfair, as long as the people accept the basic legitimacy of the government, you must accept the law, and you can't burn down police stations, and you can't invade the Capitol or anything in between. That's the basic premise.
I would have made a mistake. I don't know. I did try.
So, Mike, you have some comments?
Michael
I don't know what happened to
Robinson.
Mike. Maybe he had to go away.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, anyone else? Okay, well, if that's the case, I've finished all my texts, and we'll look at public health next week.
Public health.
Yeah, questions of masks and vaccines and following the rules and
Must we wear a mask?
absolutely, unless you're at home by yourself.
Yeah.
Okay,
There is a filter with a mask. There are two actually.
very
Two
cute.
masks.
Okay, everyone have a great day. Be well, and we'll
And a
see you
good
all
Shabbos.
tomorrow or some other time. And have a great Shabbat.
Shabbos.
And have a great
Joe,
Shabbat.
call me. I'll tell you the newest deal.
What a Nestle.
Very cute. Is that an internet filter?
It's from Zoom.
Oh, that's fantastic. Very nice.
It's from Zoom. It's very nice.
Very nice.
Dobre
Oh,
noche. Dobre noche.
Dobranoc.
Nuts in
Dobranoc.
Polish, huh? Okay. Sei gesund, everyone.
Okay,
Thank you.
Shabbat Shalom.
Bye-bye.
Shabbat shalom. all.